and we are now going to go into the presentation. All of you are going to remain on mute for now, and then I will give you the ability to ask questions at the end. Thank you. And for now, I will turn it over to Daniel Constantino from Jarrett Walker and Associates.
All right. So thank you, Sloan. My name is Daniel Costantino. I'm a project manager and transit planner with Jarrett Walker and Associates. We're a small transit planning firm based in Portland. We work around the country on different systems like MSTs in cities big and small, and we're excited to be working in your community right now. I wanted to add one quick point about process and questions. Sloan mentioned that there will be questions after this presentation. In addition, if any questions pop up in your mind that you want to make sure get addressed over the course of the presentation, feel free to put them in the chat window, and we'll make sure that we get to those. And that's also an option if you're the kind of person who wants a question asked but would rather not, ask verbally or recorded, however that works. So if you're feeling shy, or if something comes up during the presentation, please feel free. Also, this meeting is being carried out simultaneously in English and Spanish. So if you want to be in the Spanish language meeting, there is a link to it in the chat. Hay la misma reunión en español. Si quieres recibir esta presentación en español y hacer preguntas en español, por favor, puedes usar el enlace en el chat. So with all that out of the way, let me just talk about what this project is and where we're at, and then proceed and see if we can get any good feedback tonight. So I have a slightly long presentation. I'm going to go through a lot of it fairly quickly. So again, any questions, I'm happy to clarify at the end. So with that said, I think we've already mentioned the team. This is a project that's led by MST's planning department, represented by Sloan Campy here tonight. And we as the consultant team are helping them along. Jarrett Walker and Associates doing the transit planning work. We have some help from some of our associates at AMA Transit Planning on the public outreach. But what is this project? At its base, we are reviewing where and how much bus service MST provides and whether that needs to change. And so the intent is that we start by establishing a consistent set of goals for what transit should be doing. And then we can use those goals to design a more coherent network and set of services than what MST has had so far. So how do we do that? Well, obviously, this is a process with several steps. We started back in January, and over the winter and the spring, we took the opportunity to research MST's network and your community, both from a data perspective, looking at where people live, where people work, all kinds of census and related data that tell us about your community, but also by doing a sort of more on the ground research by recruiting focus groups of riders and key stakeholders, and actually doing a telephone survey, sort of like a political poll, with 500 residents of Monterey County from throughout the county, and every age, race, income group, etc. So we did this whole research process over winter and spring so that we could gather some initial input on what matters to people in Monterey County about how transit should work. And using both the data and the information from the public about what matters to them or to you, we use that to basically design a draft of what MST's bus network could look like next year if the changes happen. So now we have this draft network out for comment. It's available on MST's website at mst.org/COA, and we are gathering feedback, and we hope to get as much feedback as possible, be it tonight, be it through an online survey that's on right now at mstcommunitysurvey.com, and through various other forums that we're organizing, and so that we can use that feedback to make adjustments and get to a final plan. So I've mentioned the word bus network a couple times, and you might be wondering what exactly that means. By bus network, we mean the set of bus lines that MST operates throughout Monterey County, and in some cases in adjacent areas as well. What you see on this slide in front of you right now is a map of the core of the existing network in the kind of core urban areas of Monterey County: Salinas, Marina, Seaside, Monterey, Carmel, Pacific Grove. And on this map, you'll notice that there are lines and that those lines have colors. And those colors matter because those colors tell you how often the bus comes on a typical weekday. So if the line is red, that means that this is a pretty frequent bus. It's a bus that comes every 15 minutes or better. If a line is blue, it comes every 30 minutes. And if a line is green, it's more like once an hour. And if it's in that kind of faint gold gray color that you might have a little bit of trouble seeing, that means that bus only comes a few times a day. And we map service this way on purpose because the more often a bus comes, the easier it is to see it, to understand where it goes, and to come to rely on it. And the more useful it can be as well. So when a bus only comes a few times a day, you may not notice that it's there, and you may not want to choose to rely on it. And so in that same way that it's kind of hard to see in the real world, we want to make the things that are easy to see in the real world easy to see on this map, and vice versa. So this is the existing network. A few key observations. There's only one route that runs every 15 minutes or better on weekdays right now. That's Route 41 in Salinas. You'll notice that most of the routes operate once an hour or less, and that's an important consideration in this process. I started by showing you a map of the core area of the county, but we know that MST operates much farther out than that core. There are services in many parts of the county, including in particular Route 23 out to the South County from Salinas to King City, but also almost hourly service between Salinas and Watsonville, and some occasional routes that go to places like Big Sur and Paso Robles, etc. So we have the network right now. It would be legitimate to ask why the network needs a redesign. You have a service, it's running, people ride it. What's wrong? Well, a few things potentially, but one of the reasons to do this is simply that it's been a long time since MST has taken a comprehensive look at its service. It's been about 20 years. And in that time, MST has done what it reasonably can to be responsive to many different requests that come in. And generally the policy has been to try to accommodate as many of those requests as possible. But when that happens, when you respond to a lot of individual requests, you end up getting very complex service. And you end up getting service that looks a little bit like this, which is a slide showing you a map of the service around Monterey and Seaside. And you can see on this map, which uses the same colors as the prior maps, that there are many bus lines in the Monterey, Seaside, Carmel area. But that again, almost all of them operate once an hour or less. And you can also see that there are many bus lines that overlap. And so there are, for example, no fewer than 9 bus lines operating at various parts of the Highway 1 corridor between Monterey Transit Plaza and Carmel. But all these buses do slightly different things. They all go to slightly different places. They peel off and back on to the main corridor in different ways. And that makes the service hard to understand. And it also means that any given bus line really doesn't come very often and is hard to use. And in particular, it's hard to use because it ends up meaning that you end up waiting for the bus. So it takes a very long time in a low frequency system like you have right now for anyone to get anywhere. And that's because if you want to ride the bus to get anywhere, you end up spending a lot of time waiting, often more times than you might actually be riding the bus. And even if you are the kind of person who can look at a bus schedule and say, hey, well, the next bus is in 45 minutes, I'll go and, I don't know, make a batch of tomato sauce while that's happening, you're still spending time waiting in the sense that you aren't going at the moment when you want to go. You are adapting your schedule to go at the moment when service is available. So low frequency is one reason. Another reason to look at the service after 20 years in a comprehensive way is simply that the county has changed and people don't all live and work where they used to. And in particular, some areas have grown more than others. So we know, looking at census data from the last 2 decades, that in particular, the South County cities along Highway 101 have grown a lot, as well as large parts of North Salinas, and also the many neighborhoods in the outlying parts and central parts of Marina have grown a lot, while other areas around Monterey, Pacific Grove, some older neighborhoods in Salinas, and really much of the rest of the county have either not seen much growth or have had their population actually decline in that time. Another thing that's true about the current network, and is a good reason to review it, is that there's just very clearly not an amount and a type of service in Salinas that matches the level of demand and need that exists in that community. So Salinas is by far the largest community in Monterey County. About 180,000 people live in Salinas. It's also a 5 by 5 mile square. And so even though it looks fairly suburban, it's all contained in this relatively small area that turns out to be fairly dense and turns out to be of a size where many people need to make trips that are, maybe they're 2, 3, 4 miles long. So they're relatively short trips, but they're too long to walk. But most of the city is served by bus lines that come once an hour or less. And so it just takes too long to wait for the bus for that to make sense. And so a lot of trips end up being driven that don't necessarily need to be so. And finally, the pandemic, of course, is a reason to review everything that every transit agency does. There have been massive changes to transit ridership during the pandemic. Ridership's been down a lot. It is slowly coming back up. I have this number of down 70%. That was kind of at the worst parts of 2020. I'm not exactly sure what it is now, but it has been coming back up. But also we noticed various things during the pandemic and the ridership patterns that were apparent then. It was very clear that the people who continue to ride the bus, even when the situation is really the most dire, happen to be people who are more likely to be in low-income communities of color, who are more likely to be essential workers, and who are more likely to travel at kind of any time of the day on any day of the week. So knowing all that, what does this all mean for the future? When we're looking at how to design transit networks, a transit network for Monterey County, we have to look at where people live and where they go. And we have some of that information. What I'm showing you right now is a map of population and job density. So places that show up in blue on this map are places where there are a lot of people in a small area, and places that show up in kind of shades of yellow or orange are places where there are a lot of jobs. And what we can see from this map, and what you probably know from your personal experience, is that people and jobs are pretty spread out in this county. Most people, will live somewhere in between King City, Monterey, and Watsonville, but there are many communities along the way. And even if you look at these places that have relatively high density that show up on this map, you know that many people live outside of those areas. And in fact, the people who live in fairly dense areas are, maybe half to 60% of the population. So that's a big challenge when you design a bus network, because buses work because many people can get to a bus stop. They work when you, so knowing the population is spread out means that there's only so much the bus network can do. And so that's true at the regional level, and it's even to some extent true in your core urban areas, where now I've zoomed in this same map, and you can see that, well, in Salinas, there's a fairly continuous amount of density throughout the city. Even in the kind of Bay and Monterey Peninsula area, some areas are denser than others, and so the population is fairly spread out kind of into many different areas. So you might think, okay, well, the whole population is spread out. Maybe that's an issue, but maybe everyone doesn't need the bus as much as others do. And who might need the bus more? So people often think about two categories of the population that might need bus service more. One of those is people with relatively low incomes. People with low incomes often have kind of fewer general choices in life, perhaps more likely not to have a car, or perhaps even more so to live in a household where there are fewer cars than adults. And if you look at where low-income people live, well, you'll notice that although, yeah, some areas have more low-income people than others, there are decent numbers of low-income people throughout every place where there are large numbers of people in Monterey County. And similar situation, if you think about another potentially high-need population, people who are seniors, aged 60 or over, 65 or over. This is a map that shows the density of this population, the seniors in the greater Salinas, Monterey, Seaside, et cetera area. You can see that again, where there are people, there are seniors. So we can't solve this problem simply by targeting simply by deciding that, oh, hey, it turns out the people with high need all live here, so we'll cover there. Other challenges, even in communities that are really spread out, if there's a single place to go, you can focus the transit network on that one downtown and just send everyone there, and you can know that you've given everyone the opportunity to reach all necessary services. But you know from living in this community that there is no one downtown to Monterey County. There are kind of two bigger ones, one in Salinas and one in Monterey, where there are perhaps more jobs, more activities in a small area than in other places. But we also know that in reality, people travel all over the place and have for many different reasons. And so what I'm showing you right now is kind of a diagram that we developed early on in this project when we were talking to riders about where they travel to and for what reasons. And you can see that people travel between the peninsula and Seaside Marina and Salinas in the South County for many different reasons in relatively large numbers. So we need to serve, or at least attempt to serve, as many of those different needs as possible. Last challenge that's worth noting is simply that I mentioned that where people live and work has changed. And what's especially true is that most of the areas that have grown the most are the places that are farthest from significant concentrations of activity, which means that people need to be traveling farther and farther on average to get to the places where they need to go. That's something that MST has to deal with. It's not something that MST can change, but it does mean that MST has to spread service out a fair bit, which impacts how useful service can become. So those are the basic background conditions. How do you decide, how do you make choices about where to draw a bus line and where not to? Well, first thing is where and how much service should be provided. So we know that right now, about half of MST's service is in the greater Seaside Monterey urban area. About a third is in the greater Salinas and Baronda area, and the rest is kind of throughout the county. And so one question that we wanted to ask policymakers and the public is that the right balance? And if not, what should it be? Another thing that we needed to get direction on was the question of ridership versus coverage. And what this basically means is that we have a certain amount, MST has a certain amount of money that it can use to provide service. That money isn't increasing. It's probably going to be relatively stable for the next couple years. So we have a fixed budget, and within a fixed budget, we have to make a decision between how much service is planned to be frequent and direct so they can be useful for many different trips. And that's the kind of service that generates high ridership, but can sometimes be far from people because it has to follow straight lines on main roads, versus how much service we provide that is trying to get to as close as possible to as many people and places as possible. But by doing that, you spread service out so it can't come very often. And we call that kind of service coverage service. When we looked at the existing network, we found that about 40% of MST's current service is being provided in places and at frequencies that would generate the most ridership possible, while about 60% was being used to extend coverage as far out as possible. And so we needed direction on this. Is that the right balance? And if not, what should it be? And finally, there's a question about what to do with service that is for coverage purposes. Who are we trying to cover? Are we trying to cover everyone, or are we trying to cover people and communities that might need it more than others? So part of that question is already resolved by the voters of Monterey County, who voted for Measure Q a few years ago, and that measure gives a dedicated source of funding to meet the relatively higher needs of seniors and people with disabilities, as well as veterans. But there isn't a dedicated source for the relatively high needs of low-income communities and people who don't own cars. And so we asked, should we be explicitly prioritizing those needs in designing service? We asked the public first, and then we asked the policymakers on MST's board of directors. And we asked the public in a number of ways. We carried focus groups with existing riders who self-selected by filling out a recruitment survey that was advertised on the bus. We had some groups in English and a few in Spanish as well. We did a phone survey that was carried out, as I said previously, basically like a political poll with a sample of 500 responses chosen to reflect the entire county and the full diversity of its population. And there were also interviews and focus groups with specific key stakeholder organizations like employers, healthcare facilities, social service agencies, city and local governments, and others. And there was a public meeting in phase 1 as well. So we used all those means to gather input on these questions. And what I'm going to show you in the next few slides is really what we heard from the survey, but it reflects what we heard overall, which is, first of all, that overall, the public in Monterey County seems like it values usefulness and frequency of service somewhat more than coverage to as many places as possible. We asked this question several different ways in the survey, and it came up in many of the different conversations. And it's pretty clear that people wish the bus were more frequent, and that although there's some interest in having the bus go to as many places as possible, it's perhaps less strong than frequency. And you see a result like what I'm showing here, which is 64% for fast and frequent service and only 35% for coverage. I should stress, though, that you wouldn't want to interpret that as like, you know, a Biden-Trump poll. It's not like it's not a landslide election win. What we're saying is most people value frequency and usefulness somewhat more, but a lot of people still value coverage. So that's how we heard about that. But when we heard that people value the usefulness and the frequency more, we also heard at the same time that they're not willing to make sacrifices on coverage that would impact equity and specifically the needs of people with low incomes. Overwhelmingly, over and over, what we hear is that you know, high frequency is good, but don't take service away from the people who need it the most. And that's true when we asked also questions that were a little bit more detailed. We asked people to prioritize various different things that MST could do. And when we asked, and what was clear is that, you know, the people who we talked to very much value all the different things MST can do, but they value certain things more than others. So when we asked if various things were extremely important or very important or somewhat important, the highest number of people said that things like routes tailored to needs of the elderly, the disabled, and people who lack vehicles were the most important. And so equity goals come out on top, followed by various different goals that correlate to higher levels of ridership and higher levels of usefulness, followed by the coverage goal, get to as many places as possible, regardless of whether people are going to ride, but because it's important to provide basic insurance. To be clear, a majority of people still think coverage is important. It's just a smaller majority than for the other competing goals. So that's the context. Now it's about time I started talking to you about the plan. So we presented this public opinion and various inputs that we got to the MST Board of Directors and asked them what we should do. And they said, okay, well, that tells us that you should probably focus a little bit more on ridership and frequency and a little bit less on coverage. So instead of 40% ridership, 60% coverage, flip it around, 60% ridership, 40% coverage. They said, yes, you definitely should prioritize coverage that serves the needs of low income and low car ownership communities. And they also said we should be trying to rebalance service a little bit so that there would be kind of an equal amount of service in Salinas versus in the greater Seaside Monterey Marina area, and a little bit more regional service as well. Just to be clear, again, I mentioned Measure Q earlier. The direction we got doesn't say that we should reallocate Measure Q or any contract services. This is about general services that everyone's paying for. So what does this direction add up to? What it means is a little more focus on frequency and on straight direct routes, a little more service targeted at low-income communities and destinations where many people go, and less service in areas that have just very, very low population density where you're never going to get close to that many people with a bus stop. We developed 3 different scenarios in this draft plan related to the amount of resources available. But really the one we're going to be presenting tonight is the medium scenario, which matches MST's expected funding in 2022-2023, which is when this would be implemented. The low and high scenarios existed to help MST prepare to future situations like another budget crisis, for example, or some other critical constraint. And then there's a high scenario that we developed, and those are all in the report. The high scenario shows what MST could do if they had more money, say another 8 cents sales tax. But right now that money isn't on the table, so we're going to take you through the medium funding scenario. So here we are back at the existing core network. This is the existing network of MST bus lines in the core urban areas of Monterey County. And again, color is frequency. Red lines come every 15 or better. Blue about every 30, green about once an hour, and gold just a few times a day. And here's the draft plan with the same colors. And I'm going to take you back and forth a couple times and then start describing it. So here's existing. Here's the draft plan. Here's existing. And here's the draft plan. So a couple quick observations here. First of all, you'll notice that we've gone from having only one red line, the 41 in East Salinas, to having 3. Right now, the Jazz in Monterey and Seaside, when the Jazz A and B run together, they run almost every 15 minutes, but not quite. And we've made a change to the design of the A and B so that they can run together for longer and have a more consistent 15-minute headway. Also, Route 49 on North Main Street in Salinas would run every 15 minutes. So there are more red lines. There are also more blue lines running about every 30 minutes, particularly in Salinas. And there are far fewer lines that run once an hour or less. And that comes down to having kind of grouped various services together so that where you have many routes that overlap each other and run once an hour or less, we've tried to put those together into a single route that runs at least once an hour. So how does that affect how many people are near service? Right now, about half of Monterey County residents are within a half-mile walk of some kind of service. Most of those people are near a service, that comes, less than every 20 minutes. And similarly, about half or slightly less than half of jobs are near transit. Under the draft plan, this would change a little bit in total, where you would get to almost 60% of residents near transit. But what's really important to note is that the colors in the chart change. So here I'm showing you the existing network. The colors on this chart are the same as on the map. And you can see that only 10% of residents are near frequent service, and really just about 27% are near service that is more or less every 30 minutes or better. Under the draft plan, that would increase from 27% to 46% of residents near service every 30 minutes or better. So more people, slightly more people would be near transit, and a lot more people would be near transit that operates at least every half hour. Other thing that's important to note about this plan is it's not just about where the bus runs, but how the service is organized together to form a network. Right now, MST runs many different bus routes. They all mostly run independently because they're all trying to do separate things from each other. In the draft plan, the bus services, particularly the ones that only operate every 30 or 60 minutes, are designed to work together. And the way that that happens is with timed connections, particularly at Salinas Transit Center and Monterey Transit Plaza, where what would happen is all of the buses shown in blue that come every half hour would arrive at those two locations at the same time, say 10 minutes and 40 minutes after the hour, and they would all leave at the same time 5 minutes later, which means if you're trying to get from one end of Salinas to another, for example, you can take a bus, go to Salinas Transit Center, and know that you only will have to wait 5 minutes for your next bus. Similarly, the buses that come once an hour also all meet. And so once an hour, all the blue and green lines that you see on this diagram come together at the locations that are shown here. And so in particular, Monterey Transit Plaza and Salinas Transit Center. So that is designed to make it possible to go across town and across the region much faster, so that you know that even if you have to wait a long time for the first bus, you won't have to wait a long time for the second bus. You may reasonably be thinking, but wait, if this is a system based on transfers, a lot of people will have to pay more to ride the bus. And that's true in the existing fare system. But MST knows, and MST is working on the notion that to make this system work, transfers will need to become free. And so that's something that's ongoing and that would be implemented concurrently with this plan if this plan comes to pass. So the end result here of this, higher frequency, more direct routes, and timed connections, is that many, many trips would get shorter. So what I'm showing you right now is a table that shows time savings between 12 or 13 different key locations throughout the county. And basically, I'm not going to go through the whole table, but if it's in green, it will take less time to get there. If it's in orange, it will take more time to get there. And if it's in gray, it'll be about the same thing within 5 minutes. And most of this is in green. And really the reason why there would be such time savings comes down to higher frequency, which means less waiting, timed connections, which also mean less waiting, and then to some extent also more direct paths on certain key routes like the Jazz, like Route 23 from South County, that would reduce the amount of time people spend on the actual bus. So now to get to what's happening within each major area of the county. So here's the situation for the network in Salinas right now. Again, using the same frequency colors we've been using. And what you can see is, what I've described previously. There's a lot of routes in Salinas, but there's not actually that much service. And so if you're not near Route 20 or near Route 41, in the whole rest of Salinas, you're near a bus that comes once an hour or less. And here's what we're planning. So existing, draft plan, existing, draft plan. So what this draft plan would essentially propose in Salinas is that the majority of the city would be served at least every 30 minutes, and there'd be an additional service every 15 minutes or better on North Main Street. So there would be somewhat more service in Salinas. It would be more frequent, and there would be some new routes like Route 46, for example, which would actually provide a very direct path from downtown Salinas to the adult school and to Natividad Hospital. And when you think about that, well, that's a short route. That doesn't serve a lot of places, sure, but it serves very important places. And because you have time transfers, you can come from anywhere in Salinas and get to those destinations in a prompt way. There'd also be a route to CSUMB, kind of sort of like there was previously, but that route now would go from Salinas Transit Center to CSUMB, and it would operate slightly more frequently, once an hour. So the result in Salinas in terms of who'd be near service is, more or less the same number of people in total would be near service. But now over 2/3 or almost 2/3 of residents, 66% would be near service every 30 minutes or better, and half of the jobs as well. So how might that affect an actual trip? Here's a quick example of a trip, kind of trip that probably happens all the time. Not this specific one, but this kind of trip in Salinas, which is someone needs to get about 4 miles across town. In this case, going from somewhere in North Salinas to Salinas Valley Memorial Hospital in South Salinas. And maybe they don't have a car, or this isn't a good day to use the family car for whatever reason. And they want to take the bus to do it. And well, it takes a very long time. It takes an hour and 20 minutes. And it takes that amount of time because the bus doesn't come very often. You have to take 2 different buses to get from point A to point B. They both come every 60 minutes. And so even if the timing works well in one place, it doesn't work as well when you get there because the bus only arrives once an hour at your destination as well. So that trip takes about an hour and 20 minutes right now. And that's if you're going southbound. If you're coming home, it actually takes longer because the connection between the 2 lines shown here, 48 and 49, is not good in the northbound direction. With higher frequency service and with connections that are actually organized in time, we can shave a lot of time off of this trip and similar trips. In this case, the draft plan would save about 25 minutes on this particular trip, which is, getting from North Salinas to the hospital by 9 a.m. And so that is, not something that would make transit, faster than a car per se, but it is something that would make transits a lot less onerous on the people that need to use it, and maybe an option in some cases for people who may occasionally need to use transit. So that's Salinas. Here is the existing network in the Monterey Peninsula and adjacent bay cities of Seaside and Marina. So as I've pointed out before, you have a situation with just really complex service, particularly in that core air triangle between Monterey, Carmel, and Seaside, with a whole lot of routes, but that are very infrequent and that are often indirect. So in this area, what we're proposing is basically a fair amount of consolidation of routes, but that gets to most of the same places that are served right now. And so unlike in Salinas, there isn't more service proposed in this area than now. There's actually a little bit less in total because we're rebalancing, but we've tried to keep service to as many of the places as have it right now, and we've tried to make it more useful. So what's being proposed here is the Jazz A and B would continue to be the most frequent route. They'd run every 15 minutes together from Cannery Row all the way out to Seaside, to the south part of Seaside, and then they'd join again right before Sand City Station. And they would do this running together the whole way. You would no longer have one of the branches doing a deviation into MPC. And so that would mean that people who are riding the Jazz through from Monterey to Seaside would no longer, on every other bus have to take a deviation. And at the same time, they could rely on a bus every 15 minutes more. Other important things to note, Monterey to Carmel, I mentioned that there were many, many bus routes right now, but they're all very infrequent. And what ends up happening is that effectively right now, there may be all these bus lines, but you might still have to wait 40 minutes between two buses. So we would replace this with Route 2, which would be a service every 30 minutes between Monterey and Carmel by the Sea, consistently throughout the day. Further north, service to CSUMB and Marina. So Route 20, by the way, I didn't mention this, but this is important for both Marina and Salinas, would remain largely in its current form, except it would have timed connections in Monterey and Salinas. But then connecting kind of the northern part of this area, we'd have routes 17 and 18, and those would go from Marina and covering some residential neighborhoods in the northern part of Marina, and then splitting to serve as many as possible of neighborhoods in South Marina and in North Seaside, joining at CSUMB. And so effectively what that means is there'd be service every 30 minutes between Marina and CSUMB and Sand City. And because there'd be a time transfer, you could still get there from anywhere else, because if you were on, say, Route 20 and you wanted to go to CSUMB, well, you could, coming from Monterey, you'd get off at Sand City and you'd wait 3 minutes and then you'd be on your bus to CSUMB. As regards kind of the hills south of Monterey, many of those, the routes that are there would be replaced by routes 7 and 8. There would be a route 7 that would be kind of the direct service between downtown Monterey, downtown Monterey, the airport area, and Ryan Ranch, and a Route 8 that would serve downtown Monterey, but also Monterey Peninsula College, various senior housing facilities, as well as Del Monte Center and Chomp. Still should note a couple areas that would no longer be covered by this plan. One is the Del Monte Forest more generally, and the Skyline area in Monterey that right now have very infrequent service, just a few times a day, but here they would no longer be served. And also Canyon Del Rey, currently there is weekend service to Del Rey Oaks, which would not be there in this draft plan. So again, in terms of how many people would be near transit, this is existing, this is proposed, and you can see that the total number doesn't change. A few more people would be near frequent service, less dramatic overall changes in the Bay than in Salinas. And so maybe here's a trip example of maybe kind of an average situation. Someone, let's say that they are living in Seaside and they work at one of the shopping centers at the top of Pacific Grove. So that trip is about 6.5 miles. And right now it takes about almost an hour and a half. And so that's a long trip, and it's about 3 times longer than it takes to drive. We'd save a little bit of time on this trip. about 10 minutes, not as dramatic of an improvement as the example I showed you in Salinas. And although there's many examples and every situation is unique, I think that's a good overall kind of summary of the average. In Salinas, kind of very noticeable improvements. In the Bay and Peninsula, a lot of specific improvements, but perhaps on average, just a kind of minor change. Here's a different example, though, of kind of in this part of the service area where there'd be a big savings in time. If you're imagining someone going from Marina to downtown Pacific Grove, well, we've provided service every 30 minutes to downtown Pacific Grove instead of once an hour. And so as a result, it can take significantly less time to get there, because if you're trying to get to Pacific Grove, let's say by 9 a.m. to some job that's there, right now you only have an opportunity to get there once an hour. So you'd have to arrive at 8:15 and then you're stuck for 45 minutes. So effectively, it's as if you were traveling for 2 hours. If the bus comes twice an hour, it can arrive closer to the time at which you actually need to start work. And so you'll wait at least half an hour less. In this case, I think this particular trip would take about 45 minutes less. Regional service. Right now, other than line 20, which MST calls a regional route, but really serves the core urban areas more, most regional service is about every 2 hours. There's also on-call service in Marina and in the South County cities of Gonzalez, Soledad, Greenfield, and King City. That service exists. It does have some challenges. For example, it runs out of space pretty quickly. In any case, there's various routes. None of them come all that often, but that's also related to the distances that MST has to run to reach these places. So here's what will be proposed. So here's existing and proposed. And few kind of important things to note here. MST's kind of high volume regional route from Salinas to King City would be upgraded to run once an hour. Right now it runs about every 30 minutes in the morning, but then throughout most of the day it runs every 2 hours. This would still run every 30 minutes in the morning, but it would run once an hour throughout the day, at least once an hour. It would also run on a more direct path, so that it would take between King City and Salinas, I think about 20 minutes less driving, because it would be taking essentially a straighter path, staying closer to the highway in the center of the towns and doing less deviation. The on-call service within those South County towns would be replaced by circulator buses running on a fixed route every 30 minutes, which might be slightly less convenient for people trying to get exactly from one point A to a point B, but those buses would have a lot more capacity. People wouldn't be in situations where too many people have called before them and they can't get service for a couple hours. So there'd be that service every 30 minutes, and it would have every other one of those buses would be timed to meet Route 23. Also, the timed connection in Salinas would apply from anywhere to anyone trying to get to Watsonville. So if you were coming from anywhere in the county and going on a route headed to Salinas because you wanted to go to Watsonville, you'd get to Salinas and you'd have a time connection once an hour to Watsonville, either through Route 28 or through Route 29. So those are kind of all the good things. A couple things worth noting that are perhaps that could be viewed as not as good as what's happening right now is, for example, line 24 in the Carmel Valley. Right now, line 24 is a service that goes from Carmel Valley Village all the way to Monterey. This would change. This would now be a service to Carmel Rancho with a timed connection at Carmel Rancho into Carmel and Monterey. So that would add a few minutes to every trip, but there'd still be a timed connection. So it's still not a situation where you'd have to wait a long time twice. Also, in terms of just overall coverage, you'll notice that there's no service to Big Sur in this design. That's probably the single largest area from which this draft plan would remove coverage. And again, it's just meeting that broader direction we had, which is focus on the places where there are more people near a bus line. So quick trip example for the regional service. I mentioned going to Watsonville. If you're trying to get to Watsonville from anywhere right now using MST, you know that it can take a very long time, particularly if you're connecting. And so if you're coming from the South County right now, line 23 often gets to Salinas Transit Center just a few minutes after the bus to Watsonville left. And so you often have to wait almost an hour to get there. And so what ends up meaning is that if you were going from a place like Soledad to Watsonville, it would take you over 3 hours. And because if you did this the way that we propose with timed connection, you'd save an hour. Things we know this plan doesn't do. It doesn't significantly increase weekend service compared to where it's been. Weekend service would remain, less than weekdays, often about half as much service as on weekdays. Also true about evenings. And weekend service would also end earlier than weekday service. And this isn't improved. It's not that those things aren't important. They are very important, but we were working within a fixed budget. And within that budget, if we improve weekend and evening service, the only way to pay for it is to reduce weekday service. And there didn't seem to be support from the conversations we'd had with the public for the notion of having even less service on weekdays than you have right now. So we've been asking these questions, and we're interested to hear more about what the people on the line tonight have to say about this. Do the changes that we've proposed reflect your values and priorities? Do you think that they would have a positive or negative impact on yourself and your family and maybe the community more broadly? And are there any specific things about this plan that you feel should be corrected in the final plan? And we don't expect that what we've got here is perfect. Transit planning always requires some back and forth to make sure that we have considered every possible angle to the question. And so if there's something that feels pretty obvious to you, we're more than happy to hear it and see if it can fit within the constraints of the fixed budget, though, obviously. So we're hoping to hear from you tonight, and we're also to hear from everyone you know. So you can learn more about the draft plan on MST's website at the address shown here, mst.org/COA. And you can take the survey, which includes a lot of the key information about the plan, at mstcommunitysurvey.com. I would invite you to take this survey. I would invite you to tell everyone you know about this survey and make sure that they fill it out so that we can hear from as many people as possible. We're in the current outreach phase until the end of the month. So the sooner we hear from people, the better, and the more we'll be able to do. So here's overall where we're at in the process. So we released this draft network plan actually at the very end of August, the beginning of September. We're gathering input right now. We're hoping to process that input in November and December to get to a final plan. And if this project does result in a real change to MST's service, that would probably happen in the second half of next year. So thanks for your time. Thanks for listening to this whole presentation. And I think now is the time to go through questions. Noticed a couple people have already raised their hands. And I think that a lot of people have also posted to chat. So I think Sloan, can I hand this over to you to facilitate the questions overall and kind of the order in which we take them?
Yes, hi. Also, I want to thank everyone for being in this, listening to Daniel in this presentation. I have been fielding many of your questions in the chat and organizing them. And we'd like to kind of do this in a couple ways. So some of you have already noticed the hand raise feature for Zoom. If you have that capability, we encourage you to use it. If you have a question, and then we will call on you, we will ask you to unmute yourself, and then you can ask your question. For those of you who are a little unfamiliar with Zoom, the hand raise feature is under the Reactions tab if you're looking at a computer. It should be near the chat function there at the bottom if you're looking at Zoom. If you are having difficulty finding it, please type in the chat and we will, even if you just type, I have a question, then we know to get to you. Those of you who are on the telephone, if you do have a question, we can start with you because it's a little more difficult because you would have to dial *6 to unmute yourself. So that's *6 to unmute yourself, and then you can ask your question, and then we will respond accordingly. So first off, I want to ask out there if there's anyone who is dialing in by telephone. If you have a question, please dial *6 to unmute yourself, and we will attempt to answer your questions. I'm also going to just make sure that you can do that. And it should be working, so we'll give you guys just a minute, and then we'll get to the hand raise, those who have raised their hands, and then we'll dive into the chat questions. I've tried my best to organize everything by who asked what, and we can address them that way. So right off the bat, that's *6 if you have a question and you are on the telephone. Give it a little more time. Okay, so again, if you are on the phone, or if you join by phone, the question does come up. *6 is to unmute yourself. But why don't we go to those who have raised their hands now, starting with, I see Cindy's iPad Pro. I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself and you can ask your question.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Hi, I'm, according to your categories, I'm an impoverished senior who lives in affordable housing, very luckily, and only for the last 11 years has relied on MST. I've been very satisfied with it, but I live in Carmel by the Sea, which seems at odds with being an impoverished senior, but there are 50 of us here that are that lucky. And what you didn't put on these plans, which are very complex, and I'm very open to the possibilities. But some of us, though we can walk to the bus stop easily, getting groceries in our little carts that we own and bring work best on the large equipment, the large buses versus the small. So I've planned things around that. And the Route 2 that I use every week that pulls in behind Del Monte Center, and I'm able then with my cart and not taking a long time to get back on it because that bus can kneel in the front. I don't need the ramp, luckily, but even for people that do, is very quick to board and get me back to Carmel very easily. The new Route 2 doesn't even pull into Del Monte, but I have a feeling it might be a small bus now. And the 8, which I believe will be the bus that would pull into Del Monte to come back home, would probably be small bus also. Can you address that? It makes a big difference.
Right. So let me explain what's planned for Route 2 and Route 8 in the draft. Route 2 is not a small bus. Route 2 would be a 35-foot bus, I believe. They can't operate a 40 to Carmel, but it's the same big bus that you see in Carmel.
No, I use it every week and it's perfect for my cart. I have inline skating wheels on it. And but they won't be pulling behind Del Monte anymore.
No, it'll be staying on Monres, and so you can walk into Del Monte, but it will not pull behind. And
well, see, walking in isn't the issue, but it's with the heavy cart coming home. And to cross Monroe Street to get to coming back is risky, to say the very least, for an elder person who's handicapped and also with a heavy cart of their own.
Right. So to be clear, sorry, go ahead.
No, I would say that to me would take away one of my big safety factors. If we don't have a way for those of us that get groceries to be able to utilize the larger bus too.
Right.
Otherwise, the small bus has to take 5 to 6 minutes for the driver to get out, lower a lift in the back. I on purpose don't schedule that because it disrupts everyone's schedule.
Right.
Because the only way I can board then would be to use that lift, because I don't need a wheelchair or a walker. I just can't, with a heavy cart of groceries, board the small buses. So I'm representing a group of seniors today that have these same concerns.
Well, thank you. What I will say is, so it's the reason Route 2 doesn't pull into the Del Monte Center behind it, like the existing one in this draft plan, is to do with trying to maintain that frequency every 30 minutes and the timed transfer at Monterey Transit Plaza. So it takes a certain amount of time to run from Monterey to Carmel and back. And so the longer the route becomes, the less that can actually be guaranteed and the less reliable it becomes. So I think it's something that we can definitely look at. It may depend on other, but if we change that, we might have to change other things about Route 2 between the draft and final plan. So I think it's definitely something we can look at. I don't want to guarantee that it can be fixed.
Well, I'd be pleased if you could just look at it and see if it's possible to keep it safe for us.
I will also add, as the planning manager here, we work with the city, with the different cities on infrastructure improvements and safety improvements too. So if we are looking at, again, I don't want to guarantee anything, of course, but we do constantly monitor and seek out improvements to our system, and especially in regards to safety and serving our customers. All right, well, thank you for those comments. I'm going to move now to Christopher Wilmot.
Hello, my name is Christopher Ian Gonzalez. Can you hear me? Yes?
Yes.
Thank you. I am actually kind of bit, because I'm out in the marina area, out in the boonies where where the 20 is just literally right down the street from where I live, and also the 17 or the 18 that's in the plan. I say that's actually better than it is right now, but I remember a time when my father was, part of the board of directors and also the former mayor of the city of Marina. The plan was, the originality of the plan was supposed to be every 15 minutes because you want to be able to get people to go through the areas that are going through suburban areas, so that way people would actually take the bus versus a car. So for most of the traffic that I see that are coming from Salinas, usually tend to go through Marina, going down to Seaside, then to Monterey. So far, if I could see correctly, this plan will work to a point if be added on to later. But right now, MST and parts of the county are having a really hard time with basically consistency, both due to pandemic and budgeting issues beforehand. But right now, I see is basically a kludge of things that are bound to change later, if only people know about it. Because I actually know how to do. I know the MST schedule behind the back of my hand. My only concern is right now is basically with people who are coming out here to work from Salinas, going to Monterey, to Seaside and Monterey right now. Will that be affected? Because most of the time, when, say back then when I was working before this whole COVID issue happened, I would have to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning just to catch the 20 to get to work at the old Home Depot, just to get to the 7 o'clock shift. That would not be an issue if it basically came every 30 minutes consistently and would have worked out. But I do see people on that morning bus, usually 3 or 4 at a time, the small buses, which is good because I don't expect anyone else to be up that early. But usually if one wants to work on infrastructure and get what's going to happen later in life, is I would basically focus on the main line routes, just the 20, 17, 18, and was the line and the 40s, because you want to be able to connect to the 20, which is going outward, and or the 28, 29, which is going up north. Which reminds me, 78, you want this one going to Santa Cruz to come back, and the line 55, because I was just looking at all the other lines to get up to San Jose. Not one has one coming down until the next day. And what I would propose to basically how to alleviate that issue, and I've been looking at this because all the papers and documents are driving me insane right now. It's a 20, I would say make that like, like more constant, like to be every 16 to 25 minutes. Because that's a main line, especially with the surf project that's coming up, to make it become a bus rapid transit. That would be actually pretty good for it right now, because then that would alleviate traffic, because then people would know to take the bus versus driving there, especially when it's able to get on their schedule. Personally, and just one more question: who are the people who were surveyed under the 500 plus people who on the phone who were surveyed? And so far with the schedule right now, it's a disaster right now, but not the one that's going to be being made in the future. The one in the future that I'm looking at right now looks good, but the one right now is like terrible. Like, when it comes just to going like here to NPC, it takes me over an hour to get over there. And I've already been late multiple different times, which I'm not going to explain.
So I'm hearing several different things, and I may or may not address all of them because I'm just trying to track that. But
I'm sorry, it's just that
no,
sorry,
no,
my dad was the former, and we just barrage people with questions because it's usually like a debate mode, and I'm sorry.
it's great. We're taking notes,
Yeah.
and we'll have and it's all written down. I'll just answer what I can keep in my head right now.
Thank you.
So you mentioned specifically higher emphasis on the main lines.
Mhm.
So that would be maybe going even further in the direction that we've gone so far. You basically reducing the routes that don't come a lot and getting more frequency on the main lines. So that's something to think about. The other thing, though, I want to stress that the amount of service that these draft plan maps include don't reflect a judgment on how much service there really should be there in theory. They reflect the resources that MST has right now and expects to have in a year from now. And so within those very limited resources, MST has to, prioritize and choose, figure out what are the main lines, what are the even more main lines, which are, and so that's how we ended up with this particular distribution. And so I definitely think that, in
this
theory,
this map I'm looking at right now is actually pretty good, with making the A and the B every 15 minutes. That should have been in the first place if you kind of asked me.
So it's not to say that there shouldn't be more service and that it should be more frequent in a lot of places. It definitely should. But within the resources that are available right now, and in a way that attempts to be fair regionally, this is kind of the amount of service that's on the map. So I just wanted to make sure we address that point. Sloan, do you have anything you want to add?
No, I think you covered it very much. I will add again, because there were so many questions that I heard as well. You may absolutely, I implore you to, if you haven't done so already, to please take our survey, and you may also contact, my email is listed at the bottom of the COA webpage, and you can submit comments there.
Let me write that down. Hold on, because
Daniel, there
I
was
have
one
a couple
question
ideas.
about the e-survey, about the telephone survey. Who were the participants? If you could just
Yes.
revisit
Thank
that.
you. Thank you. Yeah, that was actually a really important question that you asked there about who were the 500 or so people that we spoke to in the survey. So the way that survey was carried out was, I said basically the same way that they carry out polls. So we hired a specialist in survey design that basically they have, the bank of phone numbers, and they call people, and then they screen people when they call, to ask them basic questions about where they're located and how old they are and things like that, so that we can get a sample of people that reflects kind of the whole county, statistically speaking. And so I don't know exactly who each of those 500 people were. But what I can say is that the 500 people, basically they called a whole lot of people throughout the county, and then they recorded the responses of a sample of people that match the county's overall characteristics in terms of where people live,
Okay.
their income, their age, their
Okay.
race, etc.
Okay. And just to let you, that's all fine and dandy, but I would be on, because if my father was, still part of the board and or alive, he would say, let's try to get all the main lines to be more frequent and or modify the way to get people from Salinas going through Marina and Sand City Seaside Monterey. But just a small little creative idea. Why not make 20 because just go down to Monterey, then Carmel by the sea, and then go back, but also keep the two at the same time.
Well, if you put the 20 and the 2, you have to pay for both of them, which means service has to come from somewhere else. And but the other problem is that the Carmel can't handle a 40-foot bus.
Oh yeah, that's true. I keep forgetting. No pun intended, small roads. Sorry. But what I'm seeing right now is actually modestly really good, with the new plan. So
Yeah.
I would say go for it.
Thank you. I want to thank you for your comments. I also want to get to other folks before the evening ends, but thank you again, Christopher, for those comments. The next person I have showing their hand up is Elena. And Elena, you also typed some questions into the chat, but let's go ahead and ask your questions here. And if we don't address something, then we can see if we can catch it there. So go ahead, please.
Okay, so I was wondering, so for the new schedule or the possible schedule or whatever it's called, so I see it's the 7. Would the 93 be cut off, and then the 7 would be like the weekends and weekdays? Because the 7, before it was cut off, it was for the weekends. If that
Right.
makes
So the 7 and the 93 would basically become one route, and it wouldn't go to Del Rey Oaks on the weekends like the 7 does now. It would be one route 7. It would operate once an hour, and it would operate 7 days a week. And I believe it would also take a straighter path from Monterey Transit Plaza to the Ryan Ranch area than right now. I think the current 7 maybe goes to Del Monte first.
I can speak to that. Currently, there are 2 trips that the Route 93 will takes in the morning that we call a Ryan Ranch Express that goes essentially to Ryan Ranch and then back to Monterey Transit Center. It does not go into Monterey Peninsula College or the communities up above MPC. Later in the day, 93 does do that. It makes those deviations. So what this plan shows is it does split it into essentially 2 routes, where 8 runs into the communities above MPC and will serve the courthouse, and 7 will run to and from Ryan Ranch on an hourly basis.
That sounds fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, Sloan, there's a question in the chat that I just want to point out about I think it's about the monthly board meetings. Someone was wondering if they can attend them on Zoom.
Yes, and I can certainly I can answer that very quickly. The short answer is yes. Our monthly board meetings are open to the public, and there is the option to join them on Zoom. You can find the Zoom link on our website in the agendas that get published every month at mst.org, and then under excuse me, about MST and board of directors and board meetings. I'll post the link to that web page here in this chat for everyone to see. There were quite a few other questions that folks were asking. I know that someone named Helen was asking some questions in the chat, but it appears that she has left. She mentioned that she had another meeting to get to. Enrique Padilla also had some questions. and I think we should address them next in the chat. He said, he was also asking about the monthly board meetings. I'm trying to see, there was quite a bit that was written here. He was wondering about line 68 to Gilroy. First of all, I was not aware that line 68 ever went to Gilroy to answer that question. And this plan does not propose that line 68, it's not proposing a line 68 in favor of a line 20, which serves a greater area in favor of an express trip. And then,
Can I address that point?
I'm sorry?
Can I address that point?
Yeah, of course.
So this applies to various things I've seen in the chat about more regional destinations like Gilroy, like San Jose, like Santa Cruz. And yeah, it's worth pointing out that there used to be MST lines that went farther into Santa Cruz County and into Santa Clara County, and that those routes aren't running right now, and that they are not proposed, in fact, in the draft plan. And again, I want to make clear that it's not that the project team thinks those lines shouldn't exist. It's that MST is in a situation where we have a certain amount of resources available in the next year. And when we looked at kind of where there are high volumes of people traveling every day, the higher volumes exist largely within the county. And it's not that people don't need to leave the county. They do. They have to go places, and some people have to do it every day. But things like very long lines cost a lot more to operate. Every trip is a lot longer. And at the same time, typically carry fewer people get on board for every mile they run. And they also, provide a value in terms of the connectivity between different communities, but they don't provide that kind of either the sort of basic insurance against isolation that an infrequent route through a neighborhood might, or the kind of high volume useful to many people a lot of the time that more frequent routes do, that are within the community. So in what we've done so far in the draft plan is not propose to bring those routes back, largely because similarly to the weekends and evenings, if those routes come back that aren't running right now, then there's something else in the system that needs to be reduced, and we couldn't find anything that to reduce that wouldn't create impacts that seemed unacceptable with the direction that we had.
Enrique Padilla actually clarified he was asking about line 86, not 68, which used to run from Salinas Valley towns to Gilroy via to San Jose. And Enrique, I hope that that answers your question. You do have the ability to unmute yourself if you would like to speak to that at all. But I do want to be mindful of everyone's time as well. There are a few more questions that are in the chat that we want to get to. I'd like to move on to Burmett's, is it Burmett? Burmett's questions in the chat. She asked a couple questions throughout the presentation, and I see you on video. If you want to unmute yourself, you can go ahead and ask them, but I've recorded your questions as well.
Yes, thank you. I was wondering about, so here I am, I live in Monterey, and I received a job, and the job requires me to travel to Watsonville. So I go there, and you're right, there's a very infrequent riders on the bus, and which discouraged me a lot. But if I do get more projects that way in Watsonville, it's good for me, it's beneficial for me. As a low-income person, a female from Monterey, and we all know that rent is very expensive, so it lets me to make more money, more revenue for myself. It makes me more be confident about my future. So how can we attract more riders, I guess, to Watsonville? Mm-hmm.
Well, I want to address 2 points. One, I just want to clarify the situation to get from Monterey to Watsonville that would exist in this plan. in this plan, if you were in Monterey, you would get to Salinas via Route 20, much like today. And then you would take either the 28 or the 29 into Watsonville, much like today. But unlike today, you would know that when you got to Salinas, you'd have a few minutes wait, and then you'd get on the next bus, and then you'd be on your way. So that's the main difference. So in this particular plan, there isn't more service between those places, but the intention is that the schedules are written to coordinate better between those services. As to how to get more riders, I mean, this is the same. This is not specific to your community. This is true everywhere. The way to get more riders is to get more service to where many people live and work. And the thing about getting more service is that you have to have the means to run it. And so the way to get more riders ultimately is to have more funds to run a level of service that's attractive to many people.
All right. Thank you for those comments and questions. I want to move on now to there was a question in the chat from Carolyn Gonzalez. She said that she believes there are no buses running every 15 minutes in the Marina area, which can encourage students to travel more to the local community. Is this correct? That's the question.
So factually, that is correct. This plan doesn't include any buses every 15 minutes within Marina. I make no statements that this is morally correct, but it is what is in this draft plan. And essentially, there are many places. There are more places than where you see service every 15 minutes or better, where we'd like to run service every 15 minutes or better. But within the budget that we had to work with, the decisions, I should say, the proposal is, because we're taking input, so then the decision may ultimately be different. The proposal is that the places where basically the most people would benefit from that are in still on the line from downtown Salinas to the Alisal, the 41 on North Main Street in Salinas, and in that corridor from Cannery Row to Seaside on the Jazz. So there is, if you have the opportunity to review the plan, there is a high scenario. This is the medium scenario. The high scenario basically shows what MST could do if it had more funds, specifically if there were another 8-cent sales tax for service, similar to Measure Q, but for general service. And what you can see if you look at that scenario is that, in fact, there are a lot of these places where MST would, if they could, operate more frequent service. In particular, Route 20, as the main sort of regional connector between Salinas and Monterey, and going through all the major communities along the way, would very much benefit from running every 15 minutes or better. But that's unfortunately not what we were able to do at this funding level in this draft plan. However, if there's very consistent feedback that 15 minutes of service in Marina is an extremely high priority, and if we're directed to do so by the board of directors, there could be. It would just mean that something else about this plan would have to change. Somewhere else, there'd have to be a reduction to pay for that.
All right. There were some. Thank you for that question, Carolyn. And there were some comments from Sarah J in the chat as well. Sarah, we did record those comments. I didn't quite see a question there, but please correct us if not. We want to again be mindful of everyone's time here, and that is about all the questions that we have in the chat. I want to just one last time give folks on the telephone an opportunity to ask a question. Again, you can do so by pressing *6 on your phone. And if that will unmute you, and then you can ask your question. But otherwise,
Sloan, maybe we could ask Daniel to speak to the question about keeping 45 and 44 together keeping them connected that Sarah J asked about, saying that there were various special needs individuals, workers, and various destinations, and she was concerned about splitting those two
Sure.
routes.
Sure, I can address that. So one thing that's, I've said, I'll just re-emphasize it, is that in this plan, when you see two routes that arrive at Salinas Transit Center, they are theoretically separate routes, but they are scheduled to all get there at the same time and leave at the same time. So if you're on a 45 and you want to go somewhere that's on the 44, you're going to arrive at the transit center and you're going to basically get off one bus and get on the next one and wait a couple minutes for the next one to be on its way. And this plan also would imply, for this plan to be feasible, that the transfer would be free. So it's in one way, even though those routes may be marked as separate on this map, they sort of don't function as separate routes in the sense that you have to wait a long time for the first one and then wait a long time for the second one again. And then pay for the honor of waiting. So there's that. However, I think that it is possible, and this is not a level of detail that we have gotten to yet, to schedule the routes such that if the 44 comes every 30 minutes and the 45 comes once an hour, if that connection is especially important, it is possible to schedule the routes such that every other 44 coming from Boronda continues out of Salinas Transit Center as a 45, right? And in the other direction as well. So that's something that, if it's important, MST can look into that when we get to the point of writing actual detailed schedules. So thank you for that comment.
All right. We would ideally like to wrap this up by no later than, we would want this meeting to go no later than 7. So we may have time for maybe one more question if it's quick. Does anyone have any final questions before we wrap up this meeting?
Christopher, you've raised your hands several times.
Yeah.
Sorry, but this is just like another issue that's, besides the, the lines at the transit centers. This is just gonna be I'm gonna say this very delicately. They stink. Because it's, and Monterey, whenever I go there, it's kind of scary to go there, can we address the issue of like how, like, the ability to get those areas cleaned? Because that's
Yeah.
another issue, because I hear
I
a
can
lot of
address
problems about that. So yeah.
I can address that. Yeah, we definitely are aware of the state of Monterey Transit Plaza. The Monterey Transit Plaza is a little interesting because
Because it's both a park and not a park at the same time. Or
I was going to say it's a piece of land that Monterey Salinas Transit actually does not own.
Oh.
So though we operate there,
Mhm.
I believe it's historical as well. It's a historical plot and it's owned by the city of Monterey. At the transit centers that we own, such as Marina Transit Exchange, we own that land.
Okay, good. That's the reason why it doesn't stink over here. That's good.
Yes, so we're able to patrol.
I'm really trying hard not to laugh. I'm sorry.
It's okay. I actually field this question fairly often, so I welcome it.
Okay.
It's because we own Monterey Transit Exchange and Salinas Transit Center, we are able to patrol it. We have unarmed security that patrols those. For liability purposes, we can't do that at Monterey Transit Plaza because it falls to the city of Monterey Police.
Okay.
So that's essentially the why. The how do we fix it is, well, we are aware of it. We work with the city on a regular basis. I understand this is not as concrete of an answer you might be looking for, but it's kind of one of those.
You're working on it. Yes.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's one of those sort of Bermuda triangles of government that you encounter every now and then. So
I knew it. It's like arg.
yes, but
Sorry.
we are definitely aware of it. We take it very seriously. We are aware of the state of them, and we definitely want our transit centers to be a welcoming and clean and safe place for our passengers. And we definitely take all of these complaints very seriously.
In that case, then I hate to say it, Marina got Monterey beat at that point because there's always security over there, and you have a bunch of bike boxes, which actually works out.
Yeah.
The one in Monterey has a homeless man, and no offense to homeless people, it's just that there are plenty of services out there to help people out. It's just a matter of putting your leg and sorry, it's a matter of putting your hat. Sorry, putting your foot inside the doorway to get help. You know, I can't say the right term at all. Sorry. But on the side note, Sarah, which one was it? Oh, yeah. I noticed there's like in Salinas, like there's not as many like, you know. Oh wait, no. I mean, can the 20 be able to stop in East Garrison? Because I always notice this one thing. It's on its way over there. But is it possible to put like a stop in East Garrison for the 20 to stop by and then continue on its way? If possible.
I am not 100% sure of this answer, but I believe there's two reasons. I believe there are two reasons why the 20 doesn't go to East Garrison right now.
Mhm.
One is simply speed and reliability. I think I think that there is a slightly shorter path
Mhm.
that runs right now. And the second one, I believe there is a flooding issue on Reservation
That's
Road.
the reason why.
Garrison,
Yeah.
that, you know, even if the time difference isn't that much, it's just a less reliable pathway. By the time you've gotten to East Garrison, you're not going to double back. You have to keep going through, and so then that makes the
Okay.
whole route less
Okay.
reliable.
Okay, because I was looking at the plan again. You want to go to the areas where people are going to take the bus, and most time that's not inner cities. That's suburban areas, like such as Marina. Because I always get like a pass like every month, like so I could take it all the way around. Because hate to say it, in Marina, there's nothing to do out here. There's nothing but houses and parks, which is good because I like the parks because they're quiet, unlike the car show that was on last week. But yeah, there in Marina, there's not a lot to do out here, but we do have our events, which are beyond awesome. But it's the buses are not frequent enough to accommodate that.
All right. I apologize. I certainly don't want to cut anyone off, but we do need to wrap up here.
Sorry.
So, first of all, I want to thank all of you for hanging in with us and for your comments and questions. All of this helps us with this, with what we are working to accomplish here through this plan. Once again, we have a survey that is related to this plan, and we do want to hear from you. We want you to push this survey to everyone you know. I'm going to put a few links in the chat. The first is going to be the link to our main page, to the mst.org page, where you can find all information about this plan, including the draft plan itself and all of the maps. Anything that you really want to know is on that page. We are going to be posting this recording and the Spanish recording as well of this meeting, so you can share it with your friends, and we encourage you to. We also encourage you to take our survey, which I am posting that in the chat as well. And Daniel has
Throwing things, Mariah.
Sorry. Daniel has been kind enough to put that up there. There's also a Spanish version of this survey, which I can also post in the chat.
I want to add that So most of the materials on the website, in fact, perhaps are in English, but if you or someone you know is only comfortable or is more comfortable in Spanish, the Spanish version of the survey has most of the maps that I've shown you tonight available to click on and in Spanish.
Yes. And also, if you want to contact us, the project contact email is down at the bottom of that webpage as well. And we are recording any and all comments that come in. And Daniel, do you just want to speak real quickly to the next steps for bringing
Sure.
this?
So do you want to, okay, so
Go ahead.
So right now we're gathering public input on the draft plan. We're gathering it through the end of this month. And then over the course of November and December, we'll be using that input and the direction we get from the board to develop a final plan. The intention is to have a final plan towards the end of the year that will then present to the board. And if they approve it, would get implemented in the second half of next year.
Okay. Thank you again to everyone who came out. We recorded your comments. Have a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.